Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second podcast on We Love Tennis. I'm Johnny with my vodka and cranberry juice, and my podcast presenter is
Rob Surtees, and I'm just chilling out with a single malt.
Great. Well, it's been a little while, so sorry about the wait, guys and girls, everyone listening out there. But in this period of the season, it tends to be the kind of off season, so there's not too much going on. So me and Rob were scratching our heads thinking, what could we come up with in terms of a podcast for you guys? And we came up with I'm the Greatest podcast. And basically what we want to talk about tonight is the debate of who is the GOAT. And we're going to break this down in two sections. First part is the GOAT in terms of the greatest British tennis player. And the second part is the greatest tennis player of all time. This is going to be a male podcast on men's tennis, and we'll do exactly the same because we believe in equal opportunity on this podcast for the ladies' games in a week or two. But we wanted to concentrate firstly on the men's side. So let's kick this off, Rob. I know you're the stats man, and I'm going to do the background side of things, and we're going to thrash it out and have a good old debate with everybody. So I wanted to kick off firstly on who's the greatest of all time on the British side of things in terms of the greatest British tennis player. You guys might be laughing out there or thinking, what's he going on about? There's not much to choose from. What? Jeremy Bates. We've got Tim Henman, who was top 5. We've got Greg Ruzetsky, who was also in the top 5 and reached the US Open final where he lost to Pat Rafter. But we broke it down in terms of two people, one of which you won't be too surprised about, everybody, and that's Sir Andy Murray. And the second is Fred Perry. And I just wanted to kick off in terms of some of the background on both. So do you think good choices there, Rob, from my point of view, in terms of the greatest of all time on the British men's side?
Yeah, absolutely, Johnny. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I know that we said that we would be talking about the women's tennis on another podcast, but if you go by what most people consider to be the top 5 British players of all time, they would have put Andy Murray number 1 and actually Fred Perry number 4 behind a couple of other tennis players on the women's side.
Right, so you're talking about the greatest of all time in terms of sexes, period, per se. Let's focus it on the male side, but I think that's a good point. So I just wanted to kick off maybe firstly about Andy Murray. Everybody kind of associates Andy Murray as the brooding Scotsman when he's losing. And then when he's winning behind the great Union Jack in terms of his accomplishments at 2012 and when he won Wimbledon. So it's a great divide, and I think it goes back to that press conference when they talked about the World Cup and the footy, and he kind of jokingly said, well, I'm not supporting the English because I'm Scottish, but it was a joke, and he was around about 18, 19 at the time. I think to those words in effect. So Andy Murray, in terms of my research on this, everybody, was born in Glasgow. He was brought up in Dunblane, which for some of you out there might not know where Dunblane is, but it's a little town in Scotland. See, I'm quarter Scottish, so I'm trying to show my Scottish roots there to everybody. So he and his brother, Jamie Murray, which some of you might have also know of, the tennis player side of things. He's on the men's game on the doubles side and equally accomplished on the doubles side, maybe not to the same extent. But they both got introduced into the world of tennis by his mother, Judy Murray. And I think Judy Murray talks about it at times when on the rainy Scottish days where, let's face it, everybody, you don't go to Scotland for the weather, do you? And there are plenty of rainy days. No offense to any Scots listening out there, but a fact is a fact on the weather side. And they used to come up with some innovating games indoors between the two brothers, and tennis indoors, kind of games around tennis or tennis per se, where Judy first introduced the brothers into the game. They came from quite a humble background, actually. Judy was married to Willie Murray, who's Andy and Jamie's father. And his occupation was, he was an area manager of newsagents around Scotland. And Judy Murray was a semi kind of pro tennis player and quite an accomplished coach of her own. So they got the boys into tennis as a coach. Basically, you know, in terms of Andy Murray's trajectory, it wasn't always plain sailing, everybody. I don't know if you've seen some of the documentaries out there. I don't know if you saw, Rob, when Sue Barker, I think, did a documentary on Andy before Wimbledon. And they revisited the events back in Dunblane. Basically, guys and people listening out there, the Dunblane massacre, which happened around the age of 9 years old, and Andy was actually, and the brothers actually knew the person who did it, and happened at his actual primary school. So it took a profound effect on Andy, and I think even in that documentary, Rob, did you see where you know, even when Andy kind of talks about those times, it kind of hits a deep nerve, and it's quite an emotional matter for him. And I think in those space of 12 months, mate, his parents also divorced around 10. So you've got this Andy Murray, which, you know, is having all this kind of trauma with Dunblane, his parents divorcing at 10 years old. And then you guys might be thinking, you know, what's the relevance here about the you know, the greatest of all time? But I'm just trying to set the context, and a lot of it will be context in terms of background into these great champions, because I thought it's really, really important, because we can do the stats, you know, all day long, but I think some context and some background to them all, I found it fascinating in terms of researching these people. And basically tennis became Andy's kind of escape to it all, and his love. And he at the age of about 12, he left to go to train in Spain, in Barcelona, where he studied at what's called the Xilea International School, trained by a coach called Palto Alvarez at the Sanchez Castel Academy. So excuse the pronunciations, but I'm trying to get better. But he was an already kind of promising tennis player prodigy in terms of his own rights, and they saw the potential there. I think Judy even talks about the fact that at times in getting him through to some of the tournaments, they took kind of loans out and stuff like that. It was kind of real tough going to get Andy through. And Andy often talks about why he went on to greatness and how Jamie didn't. And some of the reason was he attributed to the fact that he went to Spain and went to areas like Barcelona, Mallorca, where he, you know, I think he played with Rafa in terms of transfer sessions and training sessions, and also knocked up with Carlos Moya, which is another Mallorcan, an ex-world number one. But he comes from quite a sporting background. His granddad, Roy, on the mother's side, was an ex-football player, played for Hibernian up in Scotland. So in terms of background there from Andy, I thought it was quite something in terms of where he came from, this kind of trials and tribulations he went through his life. And anyone out there that hasn't seen the documentary in 2018, I don't know if you have, Rob, resurfacing documentary on Amazon, where he talks about, you know, I think Andy trying to come back after having a hip replacement, and what he puts his body through, and his determination. And I think that determination and his, you know, desire to prove people wrong has taken him throughout his whole life to greatness. And that's why I would argue he is the greatest British tennis player of all time. I think, you know, some of the stats I've got here, he basically finished runner-up 5 times in Australia. You know, he finished that runner-up with French. He's obviously twice Wimbledon champion that we all know. And I think and US Open champion in 2012. And guys, for those of you listening, from a personal point of view, I also did very well out of Andy Murray, supported him. So, but that's another conversation for another time. But his list of records is pretty impressive. And I don't know about you, mate, but I think one of the main things that Andy really holds to heart is his double Olympic gold in 2012 and 2016 when he beat Del Potro in the final in Brazil. And then obviously in Wimbledon after that, Andy Murray's disappointing loss against Federer where he broke down in tears. And I think he said, I'm getting better. Excuse the kind of pronunciation of Andy, but he then went on to play Federer again. And this time
he won.
Did GB great, and he won in straight sets.
Well, it sounds like to me, Johnny, thank you for your research there, because you're never too old to learn, and I certainly learned quite a few things there. I think it's also fair to also say, you talk about Andy Murray's famous sporting family, and his granddad was in football. I think it's also fair to say to everyone listening, not many people might know, but Andy Murray had the opportunity to play for Rangers, and he chose tennis over football. So, if it wasn't for Andy Murray to decide to play tennis, in fact, we still probably be talking today about the greats of Fred Perry, with nothing really to show for British tennis, and be questioning where is British tennis going. With Andy Murray, we were able to see some Grand Slam wins, and the biggest Grand Slam of all, in my opinion, being Wimbledon. He was able to be successful at Wimbledon, which was an amazing achievement for any tennis player. But the fact he chose tennis over football, thank you, Andy, because you've really put Britain on the map when it came to tennis. I think it was also interesting as well, Johnny. We talk about Andy Murray having won the US Open final, which again was a great achievement, top Grand Slam.
I remember.
But I don't know if you know that he actually won the Junior US Open in 2004. So he's actually achieved it as a junior and as an adult.
Well, yeah, I actually didn't know that precisely, Rob. So thanks for that. I remember the final though in US Open 2012 that you said, it was I remember it like yesterday, 3-2 classic against Novak. He was plain sailing for the first 2 sets. I was very, very happy guy. And then suddenly Novak comes trooping back. And luckily he had a little bit cramp in his leg and Murray pushed through. And I think that turning point of winning the US Open, his first one, although, Wimbledon has always been huge on British players and the expectation and the pressure of, the last British person to win it, which we'll go on to in terms of the other great. It took some pressure off because he had been there and done it and got through the line. So I think when he did come to win Wimbledon, it wasn't so much of a big hurdle than it might have been in previous years when he lost. But Andy's it's such an amazing kind of talent person in terms of we're very, very privileged, I think, Rob, that everybody here, people who are fans of Andy, people sitting on the fence, people who may actually don't like very much Andy's style and stuff, love him or hate him, he is an unbelievable tennis player and actual character and fighter. And his fighting spirit, I think, has enabled him to become the great Andy Murray, and I would say the greatest British tennis player of all time. But I think before we declare him the undisputed winner of British tennis, we won't go into the others of Tim Henman and Grigor Rusedski. They did some wonderful things, but sorry guys, you're great tennis players, but we're talking about the greatest here. This is all about the greatest. And the bar for me, Rob, is about winning, and especially winning the Grand Slams.
And I'm sure the other tennis players out there would also agree, because I've heard them all talking about Andy Murray and what he's achieved, and hence his knighthood.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sandy Murray. I'm talking to him like I said we were mates. I keep calling him Andy, but forgive me, Andy, if you're listening. I hope you are. Yeah, so he's doing very nicely. I think he's expanded. He's set up his own agency as well. He's signing up sports stars and everything else. He's building up his own business empire. I think he's got a nice hotel back in Dunblane area where Jamie Murray, I think, held his wedding at, and Andy was his best man. I think they tell a funny story where when Jamie asked Andy who was going to be his best man, he had to think about it between him and Ross Hutchinson, whereas Jamie obviously didn't have to think twice. It was his brother, but it was a little bit funny interlude that those guys get into. But let's talk about the other great of British tennis. Even if you don't know him, you certainly most probably have not watched him. The other great is Fred Perry. And Fred Perry, some of you out there listening to the podcast, he might be wearing one of his items or clothing, because yes, the Fred Perry I'm talking about is the same Fred Perry in terms of the clothing brand. And who was Fred Perry? Well, Fred Perry was, the first and only British tennis player to have won all 4 major Open championships. So he won Wimbledon 3 times between 1933 to 36. And he was basically the reference point to every single Wimbledon thereafter. Because yes, guys and girls listening, he was the last British tennis player to have won Wimbledon until Andy Murray won 77 years later in 2013. So Fred Perry basically came from humble beginnings. He was born in Stockport, Cheshire. His father worked as a cotton spinner and later became involved in working class politics, but he grew up around the Merseyside area. And Rob, our Fred Perry was a bit of a ladies' man.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, he was a bit of a ladies' man, guys listening to the podcast. He had romances with some leading actresses and models, some of which are Marlene Dietrich. Excuse the pronunciation to anyone related to Marlene. He became very friendly with Charlie Chaplin, and although he wasn't having an affair with Charlie Chaplin, he was a celebrity type tennis player. He's probably one of the first of his kind. And he was rumored to have some relationships with Betty Davis. Basically, he was married 3 times, Rob. He was married 3 times. And he then had 2 children with a lady called Barbara Reese from 1952. And I think after Fred Perry, put up his racket, he then approached a guy called Tibby Wenger to set up a clothing label, which focused basically on tennis shirts. And the name was derived from his exploits as being a tennis player, i.e. Fred Perry. And then one thing led to the next in terms of creating a very cool kind of sports superstar. And he was very much a celebrity type tennis player of his era, of any era. But some of his accomplishments would outdo Andy. He won 3 times Wimbledon. He also is the only player to have won 4 Grand Slams as opposed to 3 of Andy's. Would it be fair to say that the tennis, without knocking it, and obviously they were great every era, it's hard to judge different eras, but I'm going to put it out there, guys. I don't think you can compare it. I think the era, when it became from the Open era, where the tennis basically went from amateur back in Fred Perry's days to professional, it's a different gravy. It became a global sport with hundreds and hundreds of players, and the levels and the tournaments, in terms of the surfaces. I think 3 of the Grand Slams were on grass. You know,
Yeah.
so it's a complete different story. So I would argue, although Fred Perry, you know, has maybe statistically more Grand Slams and has won more Grand Slams in terms of Wimbledon, Andy Murray overall, in terms not only his final appearances, but also becoming world number one, where, you know, he did his body so much damage in becoming world number one. You know, he partly blames that to the troubles he had with his hip. That he is, in my view, by far, and I would say by far, the greatest tennis player of all time. And you know, Fred Perry would come a second, in my view. What do you think, Rob?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've read quite a bit about Fred Perry and concur with everything that you said, Johnny. I think no disrespect to everything that Fred Perry achieved in his lifetime, but tennis was a very different sport 77 years ago. Well, it was longer than that now, based on, when Andy Murray won his first title. We often said it, they're super athletes today, super athletes. I know that racket technology and various other factors like fitness and diets will all come into it as well. But the fact is, these players, it's just astonishing how they can keep going for, sometimes 5 hours, 6 hours non-stop. So yes, I think, it was a long time coming. And maybe Johnny, one day, Andy Murray will have his own, clothes brand, just like Fred Perry did.
I think it's a great point. I mean, he's quite an entrepreneur himself, so it wouldn't surprise me. Maybe he would go down the lines of Roger Federer. He's got RF as a logo. Maybe it'd be AM. I don't know. There's better people out there than me in terms of brand, but it would not surprise me. His accomplishments definitely tell you that, because I do him injustice. I mean, he basically has been runner-up in every single Grand Slam, even runner-up in French 2016. You know, 5 times runner-up Australia. You know, US Open runner-up as well, and
Yeah,
champion. So, and double Olympic champion. So, you know, I think he's the only tennis player to have won the Olympic Games twice. So,
yeah,
Andy Murray, I congratulate you. I know you've had BBC Sports Personality Award as well. I think a record, maybe 3 or 4 times to your portfolio in terms of your biography to date. But you're going to have another one. You're going to have Rob's and Johnny's podcast award of greatest
yeah.
tennis player for Britain is Andy Murray. Andy Murray. So I think we're agreed there. There's nothing contentious on that one. So shall we do it? Shall we do
Yeah,
the greats? I
yeah,
am the greatest in terms of the greatest, the GOAT, the GOAT, in terms of the greatest player of all time. So I'm going to set the background scene to our first contender, because let's face it, Rob, it can only be boiled down, and I've made the shortlist the following. I don't know if you're going to agree with this or not, but I think the
well,
following
go on.
people are listed: Rafael Nadal, Roger Federer, Novak Djokovic, Pete Sampras, and I know I'm biased, and I had to get him in there, and I'm
Let
going to
me
just
guess. Agassi?
yes, Agassi.
Well,
Well,
he
that was
has won all of them.
yeah, that's true, and I had to get him in there, and I'm going to fight my corner on that one, and why he's in there. Because we've left out some big ones like Borg and McEnroe, you know, and Laver that everybody talks
Yes.
about. Another one. So let's start off, guys, with the first one: the Spanish Bull, Rafael Nadal. So I think most of you have followed Nadal by now will know that he comes from one of the Balearic Islands, Mallorca, and he still lives there. And he's coached by Carlos Moya now. He used to be coached by Uncle Tony. Carlos Moya, for anyone who maybe in their early 20s, might not know of Carlos, but he was a former world number 1 and French Open champion. But Rafael Nadal, basically, he started life coaching under Tony, which was he was a tennis coach. And I think Tony took more interest in Rafa when he started to at the age of 8. He won an under-12 regional tennis championships. And I think at that point, Tony thought he might have something here and started to step up his training program. You know, for anyone who's followed the Uncle Tony coaching ethos with Rafa knows that he was a hard taskmaster. He wanted to make sure that Rafa was incredibly disciplined and really put through the paces. But when he was just 19 years old, Rafa won the French Open for the first time. He competed in the tournament and he reached the world ranking of number 3 and basically won 11 singles titles that year. So that's where he was soon dubbed the King of Clay, which we all know now after winning 14 French Grand Slams, which is just quite incredible. But again, a bit like Andy, his career hasn't always been a one-way steam train. He's had setbacks. He's had lots of injuries to his knees, his wrist, his back. I think, I don't know if you remember, mate, when he had to not pull out, but he was very laboured when he lost to Stan Wawrinka in the Australian Open. And he was, you know, a shadow of the man, and something went wrong with his knee, with his backside of things. But he's got a lot of the great players, they focus on two things, actually. Not put aside their, you know, talent and mentality, the nutrition side and also the athleticism in terms of the way they train sets them apart. He has a nutritionist from Mallorca who, this is a health tip for everybody and for Rob, yourself out there, mate, who advocates having a full palm of almonds every day. Apparently, is one of the secrets to being successful. So I'm going to be having my full palm of almonds every day.
I've got a nice bag of almonds and other nuts downstairs. Yes,
absolutely.
Very good for you.
Yes, yeah, they are. So he basically comes from quite a wealthy background, not wealthy like, you know, multi-millionaire, but very well-to-do kind of successful background. His father was an entrepreneur, Sebastian. He had many businesses in insurance, glass, windows, you name it, with a restaurant as well that I think Rafa says is one of his favourites on Mallorca because of the ocean view. But he also comes from a sporting background a bit like Andy, in which his uncle, Miguel, played for Real Madrid as a defender and also played for Spain in the World Cup.
Yeah, and wasn't Rafa, and I'm sure you're going to get onto it, but wasn't the great Rafa, you know, prone like Andy Murray for football at one point?
Excellent point. It seems like, unlike footballers which struggle with tennis, our tennis players don't struggle with the game of football at all. It's both of our greats. Obviously, we're talking now the greatest in the big three, and also the other ones that we mentioned. But Nadal, yes, absolutely. He could have been a football player, a bit like his uncle, but decided to go down the path of tennis, which I think, it's fair to say, was the right decision for everybody listening out there. I don't think too many people will be disappointed that Rafa chose tennis over football with the greatness that he's achieved. But he's a very family guy, mate. As we all know, if anyone's been watching Rafa, whenever you see him in his matches, he's got an entourage of his family. He's, you know, his sister, which he's incredibly close to, and his mum and dad, and also his childhood sweetheart, who he's been dating since 15. And I think they only recently got married, maybe last year. I think something like that. But a bit like, maybe I didn't mention it, but Andy's, I think I did, Andy's parents who divorced, his parents split up in 2009 and caused a bit of a downward trajectory on Rafa, who been such a family person and quite a sensitive person. I think his mum talks about in my research that amongst, you know, everything that Rafa portrays, you know, real sense of masculinity, you know, this kind of specimen of a person and athleticism, he doesn't like to sleep in the dark and had to have a TV on, apparently.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, for all you guys and girls out there, that's a quirky Rafa point. for you. And I think
As
you
a
thought,
man after my own heart. I don't talk
yeah.
in the dark, but I have to say he's my wife's favourite out of the big three. Not being biased or anything, being that she's Spanish, but yes, she's told me many a point about how Spain feel about Rafa. He's their uh, top top person in their country.
Well, he's carried the flag on the Olympics, and I think he's up there. Well, in my opinion, he's the
Yeah.
greatest ever Spaniard sporting person. Now, hit me some stats, Rob, for the argument that Rafael Nadal is the greatest.
Well, it's so hard when you sort of compare the stats between Federer, Nadal, and Novak. If we're just talking about the three current greatest tennis players, and of course, in your big five, Johnny, it's going to be interesting to see how these compare and relate to Agassi as well. And Pete Sampras. So if we just take Nadal, for instance, it's easy to say, and everyone out there is going to be going, well, we all know what Nadal's surface is. Nadal's surface is clay. That's where Nadal has been the best of the best. He's the king of clay. Undoubtedly, Nadal has had 13 victories on clay in terms of the Grand Slams. But Nadal's also won the US Open 4 times. He's also won the Australian, and he's also won Wimbledon twice. And of course, the biggest achievement for Nadal this year was equalising that 20 Grand Slam result to tie himself with Federer. As we go on, just like Federer, but unfortunately not for Novak, Nadal does have an Olympic gold. Nadal also has an Olympic gold when it comes to the doubles title. And at the same time, he's won the Davis Cup 5 times. And in terms of all-round ATP titles, he does have an impressive 86. Now, how does that actually compare with the other two players of his kind of era? Novak currently is sitting on 81 ATP titles, which of course, guys, does include the Grand Slams. So Nadal is on 86, but Federer, and we talk about Federer as being, the greatest tennis player of all time, but of course that's now going to be quite challenged. It's going to be challenged and rifled, certainly by Nadal and Novak still playing. Federer has 103 ATP titles, but just sticking with Nadal, he also has 36. I correct myself, 35 Masters 1000 titles. So quite impressive. I could go on to discuss how does that actually compare with finals against the big two. So let me just bring, some idea to where Nadal sits with the other three. I found it really interesting to see that if we just take his greatest rival, who is Nadal's greatest rival? Everybody has always said that Nadal's greatest rival is actually Federer. It's, well, I know, Johnny, you would say somebody else, but reading and looking at history, they said, one of Nadal's greatest rivals was Federer. And if you look at, in terms of what they've actually both achieved, they've played 40 matches. And head to head, Nadal does lead at 24-16 against Federer. Mm-hmm. However, in terms of who he's played the most matches against, that is actually Novak. Mm-hmm. He's played 56 matches against Novak. But I think when, we talk about what the analysts and what other, tennis presenters have always spoken about as being the great rivalry between Nadal and Federer. I think it's probably fair to say that they're going back to the old days when it used to be the battle between Federer and Nadal. But certainly of recent years, it's been the battle of Nadal and Novak.
What's the head-to-head with Novak and
Well, surprisingly, out of 56 matches, Novak has won 29 head-to-head against 27. However, if you talked about all finals, Johnny, all finals that they've been in, Novak just has a slight edge on Nadal at 15 finals to 12. However, in Grand Slams, it goes the other way. Nadal actually has 10 to 6 on Novak. So it's quite interesting because in the Grand Slams, Novak is just trailing behind Nadal, but overall, Novak is just in front of Nadal when we talk about the completeness of, the matches that they've played in.
Well, thanks for that, Rob. I put a great set of arguments there and some stats. I should nickname you Stats Rob. But yeah, that's leads us nicely to our other contender to I Am the Greatest. And for you guys out there, you might not have heard of him, but he's called Roger Federer. The RF logo on his baseball cap. But setting the scene, and I'm doing it all for every single one of these guys, but because I think the story behind who they are has shaped the person that they are and their accomplishments. And I think also it gives us context in the arguments of who is the greatest, because stats are one thing, but let's also analyze the journey and what they've been through as well as another line of argument. Roger Federer was born in Basel, Switzerland. He has a Swiss father, which I personally think he looks very much like, and a South African mother. Federer won the boys single in 1998 in Wimbledon, I believe. He also beat Pete Sampras, everybody. I think you can also YouTube it, ending his long-running dominance at Wimbledon in a 5-set thriller in 2001. Federer, like Rafa, is also the king in terms of Rafa is the king of clay and Federer is the king of Wimbledon with 8 victories. He's married to Mirka, who once was in the top 100, a fellow tennis player. And an interesting quirky fact for all those out there, Mirka was said to have been engaged to a rich Middle Eastern man before she decided upon the Swiss maestro. And the rest, everybody knows, is history. I think he made a good choice there, Mirka. I believe they actually met in the Hoffman Cup, and they have 2 sets of twins, boys and girls, which people might have seen them on the TV, especially in the last Wimbledon victory that Federer had. His family background, they're fairly, well off in terms of, they're not multimillionaires, but the difference here with Federer, that they didn't push Federer into tennis. There's no real sporting pedigree that a Rafa has with his uncle playing for Spain, and Andy has with some of his sporting genes, and his granddad playing for Hibernian. Instead, they allowed him to pursue what he wanted. In terms of his journey, everyone associates Federer a bit like a Rolex. He's always perfect. He's always imperious. He's always absolutely quality, and nothing ever goes wrong. But he's had his ups and downs. He had very much an influential coach called Peter Carter, an Australian coach and mentor to Roger, who sadly died in a car crash in 2002. And it had a profound effect on Roger. You can YouTube everybody in terms of some of his pieces that he talks about Peter. And it really does, it's quite a profound moment in terms of the emotional effect he had on him. Roger's idols were Stefan Edberg, in particular, who once coached for a period of time Roger. And he's coached currently by Ivan Ljubicic, former number 5 in the world. Federer has won the Favourites Player Award, Rob. I don't know if you know this, but he's won it for 18 years in a row.
Right. Yeah.
18 years in a row, the favourites player awards of the fans out there, which he particularly holds dear to his heart. He lives in between Switzerland and Dubai. Speaks 4 languages. I can barely speak English, but he speaks 4 languages. And that's another theme, guys. If we're giving bonus point for languages, maybe some of the greats here might edge it in terms of how many languages they speak. He has so many accomplishments to speak of, but he's chasing one accomplishment that he hasn't got right now. Well, he's actually got not one, but 2. And that is he's chasing down Jimmy Connors' most matches won, where Jimmy Connors, I think, he's won 1,274 matches, guys. And Roger's quite close to it. I don't think he ever thought he would get up there because I think Connors played up until nearly 40. But unlike Rafa and unlike Andy, he's never won a singles gold at the Olympics. So I'm going to now go over to Rob. Hit us with the stats on the argument for Federer being the greatest.
Well, okay, so Federer has won, as we know, 20 Grand Slams. And I guess we all thought that, there might be a few more in there. We never know. There still might be because Federer is still playing. Although he's not, played since the Australian Open earlier on this year. Now, looking at what Federer's stats are, he's won the French Open once. He's won the US 5 times. He's won Australia 6 times. He's won Wimbledon, as we know, 8 times. That's his surface. Federer is the greatest on grass, just like Nadal is the greatest on clay. But what I like about Federer's stats is that they're quite balanced in the sense, okay, Nadal has won the French Open 13 times. I mean, my goodness.
14. 14.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. But Federer, it's quite balanced. 8, 6, 5. There were a lot of good wins in many of the tournaments. Obviously, the French Open, he's only won that one time because we all know who's been dominating the French. We've just been speaking about him. So,
but he had a few finals, didn't he?
Yeah.
He was probably at one point the second best tennis player on clay to Rafa.
Yeah.
At one point. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So looking at the tour finals, Federer's won it 6 times, which we all know that's what Nadal wanted. Nadal wanted an ATP tour final. He didn't quite get it this year. We all know who won that. That was Medvedev. So, Nadal needs that ATP final. So he's just lacking that one. Whereas
that's a tiebreaker? A tiebreaker?
Well, it could be because, you got 2020, they're both equal, but there's 6 tour finals. You've got an Olympic gold in there. You've got 8 Olympic double titles. Nadal has 1. So not only has Federer been a fantastic singles player of all time, but, 8 double titles at the Olympics. Just incredible. And 8 normal double titles. Plus the Davis Cup. All right, okay, Nadal's won that 5 times. But then Federer has also won the Hopman Cup 3 times. But what's impressive is this. Going back to the fact, Johnny, that you were talking about how Federer is looking to chase down Connors in the greatest matches of all time in terms of who has played the most. But when it comes to the Masters, Federer has 28, but it's the 103 APT titles that he has. 103 ATP titles.
Wow.
Nadal has 86. So, the other players still have a long way to go in terms of catching Federer on the ATP titles. So that's 103 in total and it includes his 20 Grand Slams, and he's still playing.
Wow. That's incredible. That is incredible. I actually didn't know that in terms of the amount of titles he's won. You just get blown away by everything. that Roger has done. But yeah, you present a great case on the stat side again there, Rob, for Roger. And we'll return back to it when we conclude and argue who's the greatest. But it leads on to our third musketeer of the big three, the Novak Djokovic. Well, our Novak comes from Serbia, which if you don't follow tennis, you probably then you shouldn't be following tennis, because most people have that association about Novak. He's a very proud Serbian. He started playing tennis when he was 4. He was actually sent to Germany when he was 13 for training. He lives in Monte Carlo, which I know you and I have been to. Very nice place. He has 2 boys and married to Elena since 2014. Bit of background here, guys, on Novak. Novak comes from family who owned a sports company, which also had 3 restaurants. He's the eldest of 3 boys. The other 2, they've been good tennis players in their own right, but nothing near to what Novak has accomplished as a tennis player. And basically, he was brought up at a time, Rob, during the NATO bombings and the war period of 1999, when Serbia used to be known as the former Yugoslavia, and the war-torn conflict that they had with Croatia and stuff like that. So he was brought up he had a lot of kind of trials and tribulations. It's not everybody who goes through a war in terms of background. But I think he says that the period that he grew up in Serbia and Yugoslavia of old, and what they went through, gave him that hunger, that absolute hunger to achieve in doing what he needed to do and being the success that he has undoubtedly been. But long before he was a pro, everybody, Novak was called the Joker. That was his nickname. Why the Joker, you might ask? Basically, he used to make impression of his fellow pros, and he used to be rather good at it until he realised that he was a serious player, and he knuckled down and became the raging gladiatorial Novak that we all know, ripping his t-shirt, crying a war cry when he's winning a Grand Slam or a major tournament. But apart from all of that, he is fallible like everybody else. He's got a celiac intolerance ever since 2010. He's been on a gluten-free diet, which he takes very, very seriously. He's very much into kind of gluten-free spirituality stuff, which he went through a period of all things like that. But he has many, many accomplishments to speak of. One of which I'll mention before Rob, the stats guy, really. We'll mention to you guys. He basically in 2020 ended for the 6th occasion as the world number 1. So he equaled Pete Sampras' record on that front, and he's the only player to have won all the Masters tournaments. So I'm now going to conclude on Novak and pass it over to you. Why is Novak potentially the greatest?
Well, Novak, like Federer, has quite an impressive balanced score sheet. He's also won the French Open, just like Federer, just that one time, but has 3 US Grand Slams under his belt, 8 Australian Grand Slams, which makes, as we know, Novak the king of hardcourt, and he still has won 5 Wimbledons. So quite impressively, Novak is actually doing, really well on all surfaces. He's looking to come back on grass, and you just never know. The way Novak is playing at the moment, could Novak be the greatest player ever? Is it in Novak's ability to actually have 8 or 9 Wimbledons and, compete with Nadal and have 13 Australian Opens? It's quite possible. We know this year it didn't go quite Novak's way in terms of the French Open final and also what happened in the US. I know that was 2 big finals, which Novak would have wanted to have won. And he was only able to sort of be in that French final. And of course, that went to Nadal's way. But could he still be the best player of all time? Because on paper, he has 17 Grand Slams. So he's only 3 behind the 2 top players, Nadal and Federer. But by looking at Novak's ability, looking at his balanced score sheet, I think that Novak is going to have quite an impressive balanced scorecard moving forward when it comes to Australia. And I do believe that Novak's probably going to win quite a few more Wimbledons. When we look at the other titles, let's not kid. Just like Federer, he's won 5 tour finals. 5. He's also won the Davis Cup, but he doesn't have the Olympic gold. So I know Novak wants that Olympic gold. He wants that on his scorecard because his 2 biggest rivals, Federer and Nadal, both have that to his name.
Remember in 2012 with the Del Potro match, he was in tears.
Yeah, absolutely.
He lost that match in the Olympics, so I totally agree with you.
He doesn't hold any doubles titles. Okay, Federer actually has 16 doubles titles. I mean, it's just amazing when you think about what Federer's achieved. Not only is he such a fantastic single player, and I know we're talking about Novak here, but 16 doubles titles. Whether Novak will ever have a doubles title still remains to be seen. I'm not too sure about that because I don't see Novak being his gladiator warrior self looking to, maybe team up and do a doubles. But
he doesn't really play it, does he, Rob? He doesn't really play it.
No, I can't see that ever happening. Maybe later on, if maybe in slightly older age, perhaps, possibly, but probably not. I'm sure that Novak will just strive to win as many titles as he can. When we look at the overall stats, he does hold the most Masters 1000 titles. He does hold 36, but he actually holds only 81 ATP titles. So 36 Masters, 81 ATP titles. So, trailing quite a bit behind Federer on the ATP titles.
But he's much younger.
Absolutely.
Federer's what?
Absolutely.
39 going on 40 and Novak is what, going to be 34 this year?
Yeah. And I don't know whether I'm jumping ahead here, Johnny, and I'm sure you're going to cover it off in our sort of last chapter of the evening. But whether it's true or not, I have read that Federer is not going to be in the Australian Open.
That is a point that I'm going to address later. But yeah, I'm going to hit you one stat here, maybe 2 stats of my own. Almost, like playing a game of cards. I raise your king with an ace. He also is the first and only player to achieve the career Golden Masters.
Right. Yes.
And in terms of number of weeks at number one, I think he's done 282. 282. Where does that put him? Is he in the top 3 there? Behind Pete Sampras and Roger. I think Roger's the number 1 for number of weeks, isn't it? I think Roger's 310 weeks.
Yeah.
So he's in the top 3. He's 282. He's 34. Well, he's not, he's not that much behind Roger with 310, leading the number 1 amount of weeks as number 1. So watch that space, guys, in terms of that particular record potentially going. Great points, Rob. Great points. And I think with Novak, because of his age, all right, he's not spring chicken, but when you compare it to Roger and Rafa, you could say the same, but Rafa's a little bit older. But it's more Rafa's injuries that make his longevity more in question mark. Whereas when you look at Novak, he's almost built for tennis, and his movement and his lifestyle and everything
He's
else.
the Spider-Man of tennis, Johnny.
He is, and he doesn't play Rafa, he's like a raging bull with such intensity and ferocity. Whereas it's with Novak, his movement and everything else, I think makes him, he could be here. He could be here for another 6-7 years, or he could be gone next year. You just never know with life. But at the moment, he's looking good. Now, guys, it goes back to two old greats that's going to try to have an argument with these big three. And the first one I'm going to talk about is Pistol Pete Sampras. So Pistol Pete, nickname, basically came out of his legendary serve, which most analysts will argue was probably the best serve of all time. Yes, he got your John Isners, your Karlovic's, like almost 7'10" serving. But, he was only, 6'1". He just had such an amazing technique on that serve. And on a big point, you could almost bet your house that Pete would come up with an ace or an unplayable serve. So they used to call him Pistol Pete because of his accuracy on his serve. He was born in Washington, our first US entrant. His father is Greek and his mother is Jewish. So quite a mixed heritage. Sounds weird to say this, Rob, but once upon a time, his Grand Slam accomplishments were said to be never to be matched for many, many decades, if not in our lifetime. And now when I'm going to mention this figure, he's going to look relatively like, well, that's okay. And that is that he's only won 14 Grand Slams. Basically, he's won the amount of Pete has won for his whole career is the same as what Rafa won in just the French, everybody. 7 of those, so 50% of them, came from Wimbledon. He was the king of Wimbledon before Roger dethroned Pete of that title. He, along with Novak, finished 6 times, 6 times in terms of end of the year number 1. He was number 1 for about 286 weeks. Behind, I think I'll correct myself. So it's Pete number 3 at 286, and then Novak at number 2, and then obviously, like I said to you, mate, you got Roger number 1 at 310. But when I talk about context and background and why we've got to mention it in terms of the argument of GOAT, well, I don't know if many of you know this out there, guys, but Pete played throughout his career with an inherited blood disorder called thalassemia, which can cause anemia and fatigue. And I don't know about you guys, but when you've got such a syndrome, I don't think tennis is going to be your sport. Because look at the kind of athleticism, the amount of hours and everything else that goes with it in terms of how much it takes out on you. And you never would have guessed with Pete. But he only recently, I think, acknowledged that because a lot of these players and sports stars and whatever, they're very conscious that to not show any weakness with, everyone's baying for your blood in terms of, the competition of sport. But yeah, he had thalassemia. And he basically, unlike all of the other greats who with the Olympics was always an important kind of coveted matter, Pete actually turned his back on the Olympics. Back then, it wasn't so much of a big deal. There has now been, especially with everybody now making it an absolute, imperative behind the Grand Slams and the end of Tour World Championships to go to the Olympics. But he turned his back on it. And I think as time has gone on, he now regrets that, especially seeing everybody else and what it means to him. And I remember this match being his last match. I remember it because being a big Agassi fan, which I'm going to go on to our next contender, guys, and everybody listening out there, he basically had his last match at the US Open against Andre Agassi in 2003, and that's when he called it a day and finished the number 14 on 14 Grand Slams. And I don't think at that point did he feel like in the space of less than 17 years, you're going to have three players to completely overtake his hole. So that I'm putting out there as one of the contenders outside of the big three. Our last one, and it is a fan's favorite in terms of myself, is Andre Agassi. And people might say, how can you even mention Agassi when you don't even mention Laver, you don't mention McEnroe, you don't mention Borg, you don't mention Connors? Well, I'm going to give you some context why I think he's in the argument, and I'm going to hit you with it. Agassi was born in Las Vegas, in which he still lives. His mother was American. Is American, rather, still alive. And his father is Iranian American. Agassi's father was a boxer who boxed for Iran in the Olympics. Again, some of these greats, this shows like there's something in the gene pool. Agassi was a protege. He went to Nick Bollettieri's tennis camp. And a little tip out there for everybody, and to you, mate, I don't know if you've seen it, but one of the best sports documentaries that I've seen is Love Means Zero, which came out in 2018 on Amazon Prime. And he talks about Bollettieri and the Bollettieri camp. Fascinating guy. Highly recommend it. But he basically became a dominant force with Agassi in his tennis career at his tennis camp in Florida, where Jim Courier went, as did David Wheaton, and I think Michael Chang also went. So Nick was basically his second dad, and they were together for his first tennis Grand Slam victory in Wimbledon in '92 against Goran, three sets to 2 thriller. But unfortunately, they had a bit of an acrimonious split, which until now has never really been healed. But I think the sports documentary will kind of show that very well. And, you know, how the Bollettieri camp went actually bankrupt. He was giving too many scholarships away, Nick, in terms of his love for the game. So Agassi's father, in terms of background, worked in the casinos, did everything possible to make Agassi a success. But I think Agassi in his autobiography, and I think, again, maybe I'm biased here, but his autobiography, Open, which came out in 2009, is a great read for everybody. It talks about in great detail about his childhood, his love-hate relationship with tennis, and that he also took crystal meth. So unlike all the other tennis players who have a genuine, absolute love for the game, and I think because his dad was such a pushy parent and was just pushing him non-stop into the game of tennis, he as a rebellious, kind of flamboyant Agassi, please YouTube him, you see the fancy shawls, the crazy kind of hairstyle. He talked about in one instance.
Takes me back to my childhood.
Yeah, your Nike Air Maxes, you know, those fancy kind of tennis shorts and stuff like that. But he mentions why he lost one of his French Grand Slams. I think he might, I can't remember who it was with the final. And the reason being, everybody, is that under the baseball cap, Agassi was losing his hair. He was losing his hair, and he actually had staples in his long hair to keep it all in place under his baseball cap. And he was more worried about the baseball cap coming off and his whole hair coming apart than he was actually winning the French Grand Slam. And that just shows some of the stuff that was going through his head in terms of he was one of the most kind of flamboyant and kind of glamour boy of tennis. He dated Brooke Shields, he dated Barbara Streisand. He's also, and I've got to mention it, he's married to a certain Steffi Graf, who we're going to have definitely on our podcast in terms of I am the greatest on the female side. So what tennis genes there, Rob? Can you imagine it? You got Steffi Graf on the one side and you got Andre Agassi on the other side.
Yeah.
They've been married since 2001. They've got 2 boys. Do you think they're both in tennis?
Well, are they?
No.
Yeah.
No, they're not. And, you just goes to show you can't manufacture these things. The reason being, Agassi didn't want to push his children into tennis like his dad did. And instead, his eldest is playing at a high level in baseball. So he's still doing the sports side, but just not in tennis. So I'm going to hit you some stats on this one. in terms because he's like I said, I followed Agassi most of my life when I was trying to once become a player in my own right before sadly reality hit in. He only won a paltry 8 Grand Slams. And before Robert rips my argument apart, he also won the end of year ATP tennis championships. He won gold at the Olympics in '96, was number 1 in the world, won 17 Masters tournaments, and won 3 Davis Cups. And he holds a stat that is still testimony to time, and that he has the most hard-court second serve return points of 56%. His career spanned from 1986 to 2006, and he spent 101 weeks at number 1. And in 2003, everybody, he was the oldest number 1 back then. Along the way, he basically, at 33 in 2003, was the oldest number 1 until, you know, the guys have now changed all that. He's won 60 titles. And had one of the most ferocious second serve returns in the history of our sport. So that's that stat that I mentioned about second service return points on hard court still remains. He's won all 4 Grand Slams, which Pistol Pete, his great nemesis and rival, did not, despite losing head-to-head with Pete. And he retired in the US Open in 2006, losing to a player called Becker. Not Boris Becker, Benjamin Becker, everybody. And he managed to play both Nadal and Federer. So he played Nadal at Wimbledon 2006, losing to him in straight sets. And he played a great final with Federer, which I remember distinctly because I was rooting for him at the time, where he lost to Federer in 4 sets in 2005 at the US Open.
I remember that.
Yeah, do you remember that?
Yeah.
And the reason I put Agassi out there, because if you dissect it in terms of stats, he doesn't come close to the other guys on our list. But I've put him down there because of the kind of impact he made on the game and the flamboyancy. And, you know, with any sport, you've got to have people that capture the attention of people outside of our sport. Not your regular tennis fan, but those, casual watchers that basically tune into a Grand Slam but don't follow it religiously like you and I. And I think for impact perspective, the way he fell off a tree for about a year and a half and he was playing the satellite events, went to about mid-hundreds in the world, managed to come all the way back. And to go number 1 and also win Grand Slams. So that's why I put him in there in terms of the list that we have. So
he was a great fighter.
And very flamboyant.
He got his well position back. I remember that. Not many tennis players could do that.
No, and not many players would go back on a satellite tournament where they're actually flicking the score themselves. But he did. And he was a great story and one of our legends of our sport. So hit me with it, Rob. We've done the stats. We've done the background. Who's the greatest?
But it's not over yet. That's the problem.
True.
But if I had to pick one, I have to say, it's so hard because I've got such admiration for all of them. But you know, we've discussed this so much over the last year and the previous years. Will Novak be the greatest because he's got many more titles in him? But you know, we all saw what Dominic Thiem and Medvedev and other players and Tsitsipas have been able to bring to the table this year. So, you know, personally, I think finals are going to be challenged and it's going to be very, very interesting moving forward. Nadal, you know, if my wife was sitting here, she would say, no, Nadal is the greatest, 100%. I still think it's Federer at the moment. For me, the only reason why is because it's undisputed how many titles he's won. And it's not just his titles. It's the Masters, it's the ATP finals, the 16 doubles. It's, I mean, all of them are great, but at the moment, Federer on paper has a more impressive scorecard. But at the same time, I've always loved Federer's play. I've loved the beautiful tennis that he plays, how flamboyant it is. He's almost like ballet when you watch Federer
Yeah.
play tennis. I love Nadal for what he brings to the tennis courts, but I want to see more of Nadal in the US Open. I want to see Nadal challenging that. I want to see Nadal, winning a few more Wimbledons. But when you just look at what Federer has achieved across the scorecard, he has won all of those tournaments, and he's won many times in the big 3 out of 4. And that's where Novak is coming close, because he's also doing the same thing, but he hasn't quite won as many titles as Federer. Will he win the Australian Open this year? I think, he's got a fantastic chance now with Federer not being able to play. So, I'm sure we're going to say what we think is going to happen in our next podcast, but I'm already rooting for, I think the Australian Open is going to be a close one, but I think Novak's going to get that one. So that's going to put him on 18. So I still say Federer at the moment, but I like Agassi for what he's achieved. Pete Sampras, he's one of those characters. For me as a tennis player, it's a bit like Marmite. You either like Marmite or you don't. I always respected Pete Sampras for the beautiful game that he played and the amount of Wimbledons that he played. But I was almost frustrated as a child watching Sampras, because I was like, oh no, not again. Not another Wimbledon. Whereas I've never quite felt like that with Federer. I don't know what it is. I warm to Federer like I do to Nadal.
I also think it's because back then it was very much serve and volley orientated. If you remember, Wimbledon and stuff, he was the returner of the likes of Agassi, the big serve and volleyers like Sampras. Whereas now, I don't know about you, but the beauty of the rallies and the all-court play and stuff like that has taken it to a different level. So yeah. I agree.
And it's also the personality of what I see in Federer and what I see in Nadal and Novak makes a big difference as well. So yeah, at the moment, I still have to put Federer first.
Well, you make some really powerful points, and it's hard to argue against you. It really is. And I agree with you in terms of balance and spread. I do. If you're looking at balance of spread on his CV, you'd say Federer, because it ticks so many boxes, and he's kind of, all right, he's won 8 of his Grand Slams in Wimbledon, but he hasn't really been so dominated by one particular tournament, which I think is the Achilles heel of Rafa. But I'm going to argue, in fact, and I'm going to agree with your wife, I'm going to say Rafael Nadal. And
without a pleaser.
Yeah. The reason being is, like I said, for overall spread and the amount of stuff outside of Grand Slams and everything that Federer is, it's a massive, powerful argument to make him the greatest. It really is. But I'm going to break it down for the reason is he's got the same amount of Grand Slams as Roger, 20. He's going to conceivably win another 1 or 2 more, at least at the French Open, I think, especially on this year's form, which would then overtake Roger in terms of most amounts of Grand Slams. And I know I want passionately for Roger to win another Grand Slam at Wimbledon. And I made that prediction of Federer versus Novak and him winning a 5-set kind of thriller and a tie break. I just don't believe that's going to necessarily be the case. And I think he will end up on the 20. And I think Rafa will overtake him on the 20, whether it's 21, 22. I also believe their head-to-heads, Rafa is quite a bit ahead of Roger. And that is an important part. I think Agassi argues that in terms of his great rival with Pete, in terms of who was the best of his era. And he said, it was Pete, because if you look at the head-to-heads, he basically did Agassi more times than not. I'd also argue he's got the golden Grand Slam. He's won it all on all different surfaces like Roger, but he has that gold medal in the Olympics, which Roger doesn't have in the singles. He has it with doubles with Stan, the man. And I'd also say that, all right, the only fin else missing from Rafa, there's two fins missing, and they're two big important fins. One, in terms of the amount of weeks and years spent as number one, is nowhere near these guys, and I don't think it will be. Is that going to really reel him down if he overtakes him with Grand Slams? It's a difficult one, guys. And secondly, I would also say with Rafa, it is that he hasn't won the end of the year tour championships either. So the top 8 in the world, he got quite close, but really hasn't quite done it. So I would say Rafa, if you're just judging on Grand Slams, but as I'm going through my synopsis and arguments, I'm almost going towards your view a bit there, Rob.
Well, you see,
and obviously you've got Novak.
Look, I've seen Nadal play. I've been really close to watching Nadal play within a metre too of the actual court. And, he's such a good player. But it's the fact that I agree with you. I think on paper, both Nadal and Novak will win more Grand Slams than Roger Federer. 100%. Because Nadal will win another French Open. Will he win a Wimbledon, an Australian, a US? Not too sure. I think we're going to have Dominic Thiem winning a few more tournaments. Medvedev is obviously going to be in there. And when we saw the way that those players played in the ATP final, when you're just comparing them against their big 8, then it was very clear to me that Nadal is extremely fit at this moment in time for his age, and so is Novak. But we know with Novak, there seems to be a slight mental thing going on. I think it's going to be hard on the other surfaces to play the likes of Dominic Thiem, the Medvedevs. And I think that's when Nadal is going to struggle a little bit this year. But I absolutely feel he will have in the bag the French Open. Novak, however, he has that ability to be the greatest of all time because in theory, he's only 3 behind, yet he has proven, like Federer, to have won ATP finals. He has won Grand Slams on all surfaces. And I think at the moment, if there's one player that's going to beat Dominic Thiem and people on the other surfaces, it's going to be Novak. So I know where I'm going to put my money for the Australian Open. I just know it. And that's why I can't underestimate what Novak can bring to the table. But is he as loved as much as Nadal and Federer?
No.
We know the crowd warms more to the other two players.
Which he hates.
Maybe for me, if I saw that change, it's a bit like what Andy Murray had years ago, where people talked about his emotion and stuff.
Yeah, Nadal was hot.
And that all came out when he won the final and at Wimbledon, and it was just incredible emotion. I think there's just so many other factors. Like, who do people love more? They probably love Nadal and Federer more, but will Novak win more than all of them? Quite possibly. I think Novak will probably hold the most trophies, but Federer will be just loved for many different reasons. But he does have an impressive scorecard. And I know from what we've read about Federer recently, not being quite ready for the 21 Australian Open, and he's looking to get ready more for mid-year, which obviously we all know what that means. That's going to be
Wimbledon,
Wimbledon.
Olympics, US.
Yeah. I personally feel this is probably Federer's last year.
I agree with you. I think you make some excellent points. And I think we forgot to mention that Novak's head-to-head is better than, he's got a winning head-to-head with Rafa. He's got a winning head-to-head with Roger. And he's got years on his time. The only question mark with Novak, his game is there, is his mentality. Because these recent kind of losses and stuff, there's that question mark. But if his mentality is there, who's to say he doesn't equal them next year? But I'm going to have to concede to you, Rob, and I'm going to have to say at this present in time, I think you won this argument. It's Roger Federer, the greatest of all time, and Novak chasing on his heels. So on that point, I think we've spent a long time on this. We're not going to go into anything else. We're going to leave you with our thoughts. And until next time, bye-bye.